Under the blazing afternoon sun, a polished lawyer named Richard Hale steps out of his luxury car in front of a small barbershop on the corner of 5th Street. When a humble street barber named Elijah Brooks offers him a seat for a trim, Richard mocks his accent, his hands, and the filthy street he works on. But as the laughter of bystanders fills the air, Elijah's quiet eyes reflect a dignity that cuts deeper than words. The moment marks the beginning of a lesson Richard never saw coming. The sun hung low over 5th Street, washing everything in a golden haze. The cracked sidewalk shimmered with heat, and the sound of a buzzing trimmer blended with gospel music from a nearby church. A man in a navy suit stepped out of a gleaming black Mercedes, polished shoes clicking on the pavement like punctuation marks. His name was Richard Hale, one of the most successful attorneys in the city. Across the street, under a faded red awning that read Elijah's Cuts, stood a man with a gentle face and hands roughened by work. Elijah Brooks, the neighborhood barber, was trimming an old man's hair while kids played basketball in the background. His barbershop wasn't fancy, just 2 chairs, a cracked mirror, and a small radio. But it carried something money couldn't buy: warmth. Richard looked around in mild disgust. A bead of sweat ran down his temple. "Guess this is what they call local color," he muttered, adjusting his tie. Elijah noticed him standing there, then smiled kindly. "Need a trim, sir? Won't take but a few minutes." Richard gave a small laugh, the kind that sounds like a cough wrapped in pride. "You cut your hair out here? On the street?" he asked, glancing at the chipped clippers. "You even sanitize those?" A couple of bystanders chuckled, sensing tension in the air. Elijah's smile didn't fade. He simply nodded. "Yes, sir. Every morning. Been doing this for 20 years. Richard shook his head, smirking. "I make more in an hour than you make in a week, my friend. I think I'll pass." The crowd's laughter grew louder. A teenage boy snorted, whispering, "He cooked you, Eli." But Elijah didn't respond. He gently brushed off the old man's shoulders, handed him a mirror, and said quietly, "Doesn't matter how much a man makes. What matters is how much peace he carries." For a brief second, the street went quiet. The words floated in the heavy air like a prayer. Richard turned away, pretending not to hear, though something in his chest tightened. He tossed his car keys in his hand, trying to ignore the eyes watching him. When he drove off, the laughter faded behind him, replaced by the soft hum of Elijah's clippers. The barber looked at the passing Mercedes and sighed, not in anger, but in quiet understanding. He'd met men like Richard before, men who wore armor made of money, but had no peace beneath it. That night, as the city lights flickered to life, Richard found himself staring at his own reflection in the glass of his office window. For the first time, he didn't see confidence. He saw exhaustion. The echo of Elijah's calm voice replayed in his mind. What matters is how much peace he carries. The morning sun crept through the blinds of Richard Hale's high-rise apartment, slicing through the silence like judgment. His penthouse was immaculate. Polished marble floors, spotless kitchen counters, and an expensive coffee machine that hissed softly. But beneath all the gloss, something felt off. He sat at the dining table, scrolling through his phone, rereading an email from his assistant. Court hearing moved up to 10 a.m. The client's expecting a win. Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously. For the first time in years, he didn't feel certain. The mirror across the room reflected a man with tired eyes and a hollow stare. The same man who had mocked a barber just a day ago. At the courthouse, the air was thick with tension. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and Richard adjusted his tie like armor. He walked into the courtroom, his steps sharp, his smile forced. But as the hearing began, his confidence began to crumble. The judge questioned inconsistencies in his client's statements. The opposing counsel presented evidence he hadn't anticipated, and whispers filled the room. His client shot him a glare that could slice glass. Richard's throat tightened. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled papers. For the first time in his career, he didn't feel like the smartest man in the room. He felt small. The same laughter that had echoed yesterday on 5th Street now seemed to replay in his mind, mocking him from the inside. When the hearing adjourned, Richard walked out in silence. Cameras still flashed, but this time he didn't pose. He stepped outside into the cold wind and caught his reflection in a glass door. The once confident lawyer now looked like a stranger. Across town, the day unfolded differently. Elijah's barbershop buzzed with quiet life. The air smelled of aftershave and hope. A teenage boy sat nervously in the chair, wearing a thrift store suit. "Got a job interview today?" Elijah asked. The boy nodded. "Yeah, first one." Elijah smiled, patting his shoulder. "Then we'll make sure you look the part." He charged the boy nothing. He never did for those trying to start over. Later that evening, as Richard sat in his car outside his firm, he scrolled through social media absent-mindedly. A local news clip caught his eye, a segment titled, "The Street Barber Who Gives Hope." He tapped it open. The screen showed Elijah, standing under that faded red awning, cutting hair and laughing with the community. His words echoed softly. "It's not about money. It's about giving people back their dignity." Richard's throat tightened. He turned off the phone and looked at his own reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time, it hurt to see himself. The morning began like any other in the downtown courthouse, echoing footsteps, the rustle of papers, and the distant murmur of voices preparing for another day of judgment. Richard Hale straightened his tie in the hallway mirror, trying to steady his nerves. The failed case from last week still haunted him. He needed this win, not just for his career, but for his crumbling sense of control. He pushed open the heavy courtroom doors, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The air inside felt different today, tense, charged. The judge entered, the bailiff called for order, and the case began. Richard stood tall, his expression cold and professional. Then the door creaked open again. Everyone turned. A man stepped in wearing a clean white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a quiet confidence in his stride. Elijah Brooks. For a brief second, time seemed to stop. The same man Richard had humiliated on the street now stood before him. Not behind a barber's chair, but in front of a jury. The courtroom went silent, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Richard's throat went dry. He quickly shuffled his papers, pretending not to notice, but his hands trembled. The judge's voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Brooks, please take the stand." Elijah walked up, calm and steady. His eyes briefly met Richard's. Not with anger, but with something far heavier. Quiet understanding. As the questioning began, Elijah spoke softly, his tone humble but firm. He described what he'd seen in the case. A neighbor wrongly accused of theft, a struggling man being painted as a criminal because of where he lived and the color of his skin. His testimony wasn't just factual, it was deeply human. "Sometimes," Elijah said, looking toward the jury, "the truth doesn't wear a suit. Sometimes it wears calloused hands." A hush fell over the room. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Richard couldn't look up. Every word hit him like a mirror reflecting his own arrogance. The opposing counsel tried to corner Elijah with tricky questions, but he didn't flinch. His honesty was disarming. His composure was unbreakable. When Elijah stepped down from the stand, the courtroom remained quiet, a silence heavy with realization. For once, Richard felt what humiliation truly meant, not through mockery, but through grace. He watched Elijah leave, his heart sinking as if every ounce of pride had been stripped away. The same man he once ridiculed had just taught him, in front of everyone, what integrity looked like. The judge dismissed the court for recess, and Richard sat frozen at his desk. His reflection in the polished table stared back at him, tired, ashamed, human. For the first time, he didn't care about winning the case. He only wanted to face the man he'd wronged. The morning was quiet on 5th Street, the same corner where arrogance had once met humility. The clouds hung low, a soft gray mist floating above the old brick buildings. The hum of traffic blended with the faint buzz of clippers from a distance. Richard Hale stood at the end of the block, hands buried in his coat pockets. Gone was the polished suit, the leather shoes, the confident stride. He wore a plain shirt, slightly wrinkled, and a look of quiet regret. For a moment, he just stood there, watching the same man he once mocked now surrounded by laughter and kindness. Elijah Brooks was giving free haircuts again, an old veteran, a young delivery boy, a mother with her little son. His small shop still had that faded red awning, the same cracked mirror, the same folding chair that wobbled a little when someone sat too far back. But everything about the scene felt different. It wasn't just a street corner anymore. It was a place of dignity. Richard waited until the line thinned. Then, with hesitant steps, he approached. "Elijah." His voice cracked slightly. Elijah turned, surprised at first, then calm. The kind of calm that comes from forgiveness long decided. Without a word, he motioned to the chair. Richard hesitated, then sat down. The metal was cold beneath him, grounding. He stared into the cracked mirror, at a reflection that seemed both familiar and foreign. The man staring back wasn't the proud lawyer from before. He was simply Richard. The clippers buzzed softly. Each pass through his hair felt like the slow peeling away of guilt. Elijah didn't speak for a long time. Neither did Richard. The air between them carried the weight of everything that had happened. The insult, the laughter, the courtroom silence. Finally, Elijah broke the stillness. "You know," he said quietly, "mirrors don't lie. They just wait for us to stop pretending." Richard's throat tightened. His eyes burned as tears began to form, reflecting in the fractured glass. For the first time, he didn't look away. "I was wrong," he whispered. Elijah nodded slightly. "We all are, until we learn to see." Outside, the world moved on, cars honking, people passing, unaware that something sacred was happening in that small barbershop. When Elijah finished, he brushed the loose hair from Richard's shoulders, just like he did for everyone else. Then he looked into the mirror, meeting Richard's eyes. "We're all equal once the mirror is clean," he said softly. A single tear slipped down Richard's cheek, landing on his collar. He looked at his reflection, not as a man of status, but as a man finally stripped of pretense. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and paused. Elijah smiled faintly and shook his head. "This one's on the house.